Welcome back to Between Two FARS. I'm Warneke Miller, here once again with the legendary Robert Tepfer.
I like that.
Yeah.
Even better, yeah.
And we're going to talk a little bit today about the importance of debriefings and how they could potentially reduce your litigation risk. Bob, why are debriefings important?
Okay. I got involved in debriefings initially when I was the chief of litigation under the theory that it was a last-ditch attempt to prevent litigation from developing. And then I ended up providing briefings to boards regardless of whether or not they were particularly contentious. It is the last-ditch attempt because it's an effort to explain the equity of the system. We said what we would do, and then it demonstrates that we would do it. A whole lot of contractors really have no appreciation of the process that we go through and the fact that we slavishly adhere to that process, the FAR, the stated evaluation criteria. And this is our attempt to demonstrate to them what the process was and explain to them that we did in fact follow it. The hope is that if they feel they've been treated fairly, that they'll walk away, maybe not necessarily happy, but at least they won't go any further. Mm-hmm. It's an effort to explain the system, and for that reason, I've always encouraged them to go as far as they can with regard to releasing documents short of a protective order.
I was going to ask about that. The FAR requires that you give a certain amount of information during a debriefing, but often NASA gives a little bit more. What other things does NASA find helpful to share with the contractors or the offerers?
Well, the issue is one, that you show the findings and you show exactly the source selection statement. And I've always encouraged an unredacted source selection statement to the extent we can, because that demonstrates the source selection authority's adherence to the process and the criteria. And the hope again is that all the different steps start out with a statement as to how we're going to evaluate and then the adherence to that criteria. Now, interestingly enough, the GAO has not really enforced anything with regard to how a debriefing will take place, whether it be 15505 or 506. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly in your best interest to do a very good debriefing. One, because it demonstrates to the contractor the fairness, but also it helps them improve their proposal. I've seen debriefings where the group was there that effectively put the proposal together, and the president would sit back and say, I see where we messed up. We proposed the prior statement of work, and looks at the group that put it together and realizes that they didn't do a very good job.
I've sat through some of those too.
Yeah.
It's not always pleasant.
So, it's a good process, and notwithstanding the lack of a really protest issue, I think we need to embrace it to prevent protest. I guess the final thing I'd say is once they get outside counsel, the general rule is they don't go away, because that's unemployment for them. They're not going to sit back and say, oh, everything's great, we're not going to do it. They're going to at least try. And that's a very expensive, time-consuming try when they do that, because that costs us a lot of money and time.
They are coming to the table with an attorney for the debriefing. Would you recommend giving them all the consensus findings and all of the things that they would otherwise get during that first round of discovery in front of the GAO, or do you withhold stuff in that? How do you approach that situation when the attorney shows up?
I give them everything short of a protective order regardless. I would be there as an attorney, or if I were assigning an attorney, have them be there so that they don't attempt to develop it into a deposition. The contracting officer needs to keep control of it and remember that it's a study in the process as opposed to a debate over what was a consensus finding. I also try to explain to the board and to the group, don't reconvene the board and have them there. because your one option is to say this was the consensus of the board, and we don't have the board there. The other thing that I
So
tried.
let me make sure we clarify that point a little bit. So if you have enough members of the board to reach consensus in the debriefing room, and they say something that differs from the consensus paperwork that you gave them, that's your litigation risk. That's your problem, correct?
Well, it's even worse than that. If you don't have enough for a consensus, but you have somebody who's very vocal, that's a real headache too. And I try to stress to them that if you want to be a star, speak up. Because in every area there needs to be kind of one voice.
Right.
And they need to speak with that one voice. And anybody who wants to explain and demonstrate their tremendous knowledge in the area,
They're going to be a witness.
They're
aren't
going to
they?
be a witness, right?
Let's talk a little bit next time about how we reduce our litigation risk within the debriefing. I think right now we've talked about why providing the information and having the debriefing is important in reducing our litigation risk. But let's talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts about how to do that in our next episode.
Okay.
Join us back here between two FARS.